I'm Jason Palmer, one of the hosts of The Intelligence, The Economist's daily current affairs podcast. The Economist's award-winning shows make sense of what matters, from our special series on China's president to our weekly podcasts on business, technology, and American politics. Our journalists provide fair, in-depth reporting on the events shaping the world. Search for Economist Podcasts Plus and sign up to our free one-month trial.
This is a Rogue Media Network podcast. The Waco History Podcast is sponsored by Brotherwell Brewery on historic Bridge Street in Waco.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
Welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Sloan. My guest host is back with me, Rick Tullis. Welcome back,
Hey,
Rick.
it's great to be back.
You've grown so much since
I thought
saw you last
kicked
time.
me to the curb forever, but I've weaseled my way back. So
I continue to exploit Rick's networks, his social capital, and he has drawn in a very special guest that I'm excited about today. Rick, I'll let you introduce your guest.
Yeah. So, in fact, I connected with him back when we were doing the Crossroads series with some stuff and realized, man, he's got some good stuff that really deserves to be its own podcast. So that's where we're here today. And so Ryan Holt, who's City of Waco assistant manager, currently
Assistant city manager.
assistant to the assistant city manager, to the regional. Is with us, and I'm going to let him tell a little bit about himself, his pathway, his story. I mean, he's been able to do quite a bit in our community over the years. So, Ryan,
Sure. No, really happy to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk to you. So I've been with the city right at 28 years. Started as a rookie police officer in the Waco Police Department.
Mm-hmm.
And over the next 24 years over there, worked in just about every section of the department, patrol, detectives. We started the computer crimes unit over there, worked on the Lone Star Fugitive Task Force, where I got to meet the McNamara's when they were with the Marshal Service. A lot of fun work there. Was on the SWAT team, hostage negotiator, rose up through the ranks, ended up being an assistant chief for a number of years under then Chief Brent Stroman. And then in 2016, at the end of 2016, Dale Fissler, who was the city manager, clearly a bad judge of character, chose me to be the chief of police. And so I got to finish out my career at Waco PD as the chief until I moved over to City Hall in February of 2020. I was doing both roles, assistant city manager and police chief, through August. But as you know, went over in February.
Wow.
And about 2 weeks later, the pandemic hit. Fortunately, Frank Ginch, who's one of the assistant chiefs over there, stepped in and was interim chief for a while till we could hire the fantastic Cheryl Victorian, Dr. Cheryl Victorian, who's the chief now. So
Now, did you grow up in Waco?
No, grew up in Bryan, Texas, just down the road, about 90 miles.
Yeah.
And
Downstream.
Yep, finished my undergraduate degree over at Stephen F. Austin in Nacogdoches in criminal justice, and applied at several departments, and Waco hired us first. And so we came here, my wife and I, and been here ever since. This is home now.
Great. And so were you a kid who grew up knowing you wanted to be in law enforcement?
No, never considered it. Nobody in our family is in law enforcement. I did a Citizens Police Academy when I was a senior at Bryan High School. And I left that and I went to A&M because I lived in Bryan College Station. So I started at A&M as a business major and hated it. Then went to journalism. I was a print photographer back when we used film, and both in high school and then in college. It's kind of how I paid my way, was as a print photographer. And ultimately at A&M, I knew I couldn't make a living doing journalism. And as it turns out, so I went over to sociology and got a little bit of a taste around criminal justice. And at the time, A&M didn't offer criminal justice. There were only 3 universities in the state at the time, Stephen F., Sam Houston, and what was then Southwest Texas State University. And I knew I wanted to do law enforcement because as I was looking around trying to figure out what I wanted to do as a young kid. I had remembered my time in that Citizens Police Academy at Bryan Police Department. And, Stephen F. Austin had the criminal justice program that was more centered around law enforcement. Sam Houston was more around corrections. So went over there, absolutely loved Stephen F. Finished my undergraduate over there and came over here.
There you go.
Yeah. And now, Ryan, we were talking about this and I'll tell you a little back. I mean, Ryan has done a lot of research into the history of Waco PD. Really dug up some stuff that was unknown as he got into the art. So he's a historian also. He doesn't have the degree in that, but he's a historian by practice and the research that he's done. But now your role is you're over a lot of different city services, sure. Right? Yeah, and you were telling me the other day.
Yeah, so I've got police and fire, information technology, fleet, which is all the vehicles in the city garage, facilities. I've got animal services, the animal shelter, the joint venture, but with the Humane Society of Central Texas. And then I've also got a fairly new safety program that we've rolled out in the city. So around seven departments of the 26 or so departments we have.
Wow. So we could do an episode on every one of those
no doubt.
departments.
We could, no doubt. In the 1800s, what was animal safety? What were they doing back then?
It was a little different.
Yeah, was it?
Yeah, okay. It was a little different.
Yeah.
Well, Ryan, I'd love to start with you just talking a little bit about why you did all this research. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not like you didn't have plenty to do, but I mean, what's developed out of this, and Rick and I got a firsthand experience of this, is a very nice little museum that's been developed over at the tower, at the police tower. And I mean, it's amazing what all came from this research, but I'm interested in why you got interested in doing it.
Yeah, so the museum actually started under Chief Brent Stroman.
Okay.
And they formed a museum committee, and it kind of started when they were trying to get the memorial along the river for officers killed in the line of duty. And so the museum committee did a lot of really great research. Unfortunately, for information before 1900, they latched onto an undergraduate history project that just got it wrong in a Baylor history class. And I think it was over at the Waco Public Library. And as I got further into it, they just got the undergraduate students just got the information wrong. And so, but the museum committee had done a great job of gathering stuff up. And we've got a museum incubator over at the police department now on the 9th floor that people can make an appointment to go see. Former Chief Brent Stroman is working with a group to create a brick and mortar museum as well. So maybe I can forward along the URL for that, and folks can have access to that.
Yeah, we can put that in the show notes. That's a great idea.
They're working on a public safety museum, so it wouldn't just be Waco PD. But when I was chief, I started thinking, you see the dates of the charters of the city of Waco, and I thought, well, man, we must be coming up on a sesquicentennial. And I was thinking we'd do a special badge and a special patch and celebrate, the length of time for the department. And unfortunately, the further I got into it, I realized we had missed it. Because as it turns out, in the original charter around 1847-ish, up to 1856, they created the marshal, the town marshal, and in the charters it designates the city marshal is the de facto chief of police. And so the way the city was set up is that they created originally 4 wards. And so they had the city marshal, and then the city council came together and was able to appoint what they called policemen back then. It's not appropriate now, but policemen for each of the wards, and they reported to the marshal as the de facto chief of police.
And you just did advanced work for the bicentennial. You missed the sesquicentennial.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He's getting ahead on your work. That's good.
I'm interested in the wards because we've talked on the podcast how people kind of imagine the different areas of the city, and what were do you have a sense of what the wards were then?
I've read it, but
Yeah.
I can't. I couldn't regurgitate it to you. You know, but it included East Waco as well, across the river.
Yeah.
And back then, that was a pretty big geographical barrier. Was that river? They had a ferry at the time.
Right.
When the water was low enough, it would cross. But it wasn't until the bridge was built that it really became connected. And so they had, and they had one policeman early on. They had one policeman for each of the wards. Well. They couldn't work 24 hours. And so there were time of, but back then there was a pretty robust constable system locally in McLennan County. Obviously the sheriff's office was pretty big at the time. And so with sheriffs and constables and then the policemen and the city marshal, that was the law enforcement. And you had some of the frontier rangers around here, even if they weren't necessarily stationed here all the time.
Okay, so explain the difference between a constable and a sheriff.
So
Deputy sheriff.
They're constable and sheriff are both constitutional offices in the state of Texas, and the high sheriff in Texas counties is the highest law enforcement person in the county. Constables now are attached to justice of the peace precincts, and they serve. They have full a law enforcement authority and full law enforcement powers, but their primary duty is to serve that judicial branch in serving papers and providing security for the courts. But in Texas, there are a lot of cities where the constables have some of the largest law enforcement agencies in the county. So if you look at Harris County. They have a really robust constable system, and they have hundreds of deputies. And in Waco, the constables are still around, and they serve those justices of the peace in providing court security and court paperwork. But they all have full law enforcement authority.
And they are elected officials.
They are elected officials. Yes, both the sheriff and all the constables are elected officials.
But you have to be a certified law.
You have to be able to get it. So you can be elected before you're certified, but you have to get it. And it's changed. It was 2 years. It may be 1 year now. Through the years that has changed. Of course, back in the day, it was here's your badge, here's your gun.
And we've often talked about, we all think of McLennan County the way it is today. I mean, back then there were actually more people that lived in the county than actually lived in Waco because it was a rural farm type economy. Yeah. And even Waco itself, in this time period we're talking about, the 50s and 60s, I mean, there were 6,000 to 10,000 people in Waco proper. So in the geographic footprint wouldn't be much bigger than what we think of as downtown now.
Right.
So,
well, we're also talking about a period before civil service reform where it's a spoil system. I mean, whoever's elected gets the jobs and gets to make the appointments.
Yeah, and we see that in the trajectory of some of the people who served early on. They go on to other offices. Hollis Barron was the chief between 1907 and 1914. He goes on to be the mayor, and so occasionally you'll see a person in the list of folks who goes on to other offices, and it's hard to imagine, but there were other people sort of walking in the area at the time. You had, Lawrence Sullivan Ross, who was a sheriff. And so, Ross was working with Waco, the Waco marshals. So Pat Neff ends up appointing some of the folks from Waco to be Texas Rangers. And so there's all these connections around, and obviously with the Rangers, the history of the Rangers, locally, there's that connection as well. A number of the city officials had been Rangers or go on to be Rangers or special Rangers. And after the Civil War, there were a lot of individuals who had served in the Civil War, frankly on both sides, who became city marshals. And there's some interesting stories involved in those people. And that one of the things that interested me most is it's almost impossible for people to imagine what Waco was like at the time, but this really was the frontier. And so it took a certain type of person to decide to be the city marshal. And some of them were killed in strange ways. And I just discovered another one earlier this week that had been a newspaper. He'd run the Brazos Statesman as the publisher, and he ended up he served a very short time as the city marshal, in addition to being the publisher. But he gets murdered. J.O. Shook gets murdered by one of his printers working on the paper. And so I just discovered that this week. And so there's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down of interesting stories about. I mean, these were individuals of particular constitution to step out in really lawless times. I mean, y'all have talked about it on your podcast, the sheer volume of duels that were newsworthy. But there were a significant other number of duels and murders and that sort of thing. And so to be the law, so to speak, during that period of time took a certain type of person, and they weren't always nice.
Yeah. Well, and the people, coming out to the frontier. I mean, a lot of them were seeking the betterment of their lives, or immigrants and otherwise, but a lot of them were running from something, and running, to where there was not a lot of government control or whatnot. So, it would be a very it'd be a calling to want to be a law enforcement at that point to try to bring order.
I know your research, Ryan, kind of added to the list of chiefs going back, I think, to the founding.
So at the police department, they had done research back to Alfred C. Neal was kind of who everybody thought was the first chief of police, so to speak. And I've been able to go back and find about another 10 marshals before Alfred Neal. Back, and some of them didn't serve long, but I felt like I needed to put their name on the list because they put the badge on and they served as the marshal. They're in, a lot of my research came from handwritten council notes from 1856.
How's their handwriting, by the way?
It was interesting. It's, the cursive they used, and generally when you got to where you could read one person's handwriting, they'd change the person. And sometimes they'd spell phonetically instead of the way it was. And they'd start a word on one line and go to another. And so you almost get into a rhythm in transcribing those old records because you kind of get into their style of writing. And occasionally you'll get a word and you're like, I cannot get this word. And so you go back and look for the way they do their L's and their R's and their E's and other words. But I just went back last week and looked at the Waco Bridge Company Charter Act that was passed by the state legislature because that touches one of our marshals, and it's handwritten. And some of the other documents about the time were really crisp and legible, and that document looks like it was written in pencil. In really small cursive, and so it took me a little while to transcribe that one, but it was sort of pertinent to one of the marshals and some of the work they did.
Well, you can just hold your phone up to it and it'll transcribe it for you.
Not very well.
Yeah, I'm not sure AI has joined us for that kind of work yet.
Okay, all right.
Well, talk about this. I'm interested in this early period. I mean, you made some important discoveries there that I think of the in memoriam wall that you showed us, and even as we think about the makeup of the force, diversity over time. Share some of the findings you shared with us earlier this week.
Yeah, so the first documented marshal that I can find is a guy named L.H. Johnson. And something else I discovered is back in that time in these documents, they only used the first two initials and the last name very often. And so it's almost like an Easter egg when in a later document you see their name completely written out and you're like, oh, okay. And so you go back and update all your files from the initials. But the first guy, L.H. Johnson, was the marshal, and this was in October of 1856. So right when the city leaders are putting together that first charter, and it's an interesting charter to read because this is all pre-Civil War. This is right in the middle of all the cotton world at the time. And a guy named L.H. Johnson, and all we have is in the council notes, he shows to be marshal, and then he resigns October 15th, 1856. Interestingly, that's where we transitioned to a guy named H.A. Hockaday, and he lasts about a year. And there's, at least right now, we don't find reasons, why they don't last very long, but you can certainly imagine. And he's the marshal through 1859, and then a guy, and these people were other things before and after they were the marshal, And so back then, a lot of people were carpenters. There were some printers, and so it was interesting to see in those 1850, 1860, 1870 census records what people put as their occupation. Sometimes they would put their alternate occupation in the census when we know they were the marshal. And they would list carpenter. So clearly they were of the mind that they thought of themselves as a carpenter. They were just serving as the marshal.
So were there any standards at the time? Was it the state or any other agency providing any?
So the only thing that I can find is that you had to take an oath of office, and they had to send that oath of office to the governor's office. And y'all have talked a little bit about it before on your podcast. One of the things you had to swear to was that you hadn't been in a duel before.
Yeah.
And so I happen to have a copy of one of the of Laban James Hoffman's. And I was going to quote there it is.
His oath of office.
Yeah. So it says, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all duties incumbent on me as Marshal of Waco, McLennan County, Texas, according to the best of my skill and ability. I will support the Constitution and laws of the United States and of this state. I do further swear or affirm that since the acceptance of this Constitution by the Congress of the United States, I, being a citizen of this state, have not fought a duel with a deadly weapon or committed an assault upon any person with deadly weapons, or sent or accepted a challenge to fight a duel with a deadly weapon, or acted as a second in fighting a duel, or knowingly aided or assisted any of us offending either within this state or out of it, that I am not disqualified, and so on and so on. But it was about that duel. So other than promising that you haven't committed crimes and haven't participated in a duel, it was, are you living, breathing, and willing to wear the badge?
Do you own a gun?
Yeah.
Probably had to provide
had to bring your own
tools of the job.
Gun.
Yeah, a horse.
Which is interesting because in my research, so a guy named Laban James Hoffman becomes marshal right at 1870, right after the Civil War, and
which was a golden time.
It was interesting.
It's right before the bridge, right before the railroad. Yep. I mean, that was all right then.
Yeah, right before him, there was a guy named James Thatcher Lovejoy, but he was a Reconstruction marshal. So he was installed by the federal government at the time, and there's a pretty good record where he and his posse, which by some accounts are Union soldiers, kill a couple of guys named the Grimes Boys in town because they were making too much noise, essentially. They're buried in the First Street Cemetery, had big family around here. So James Thatcher Lovejoy had been a major in the Union Army during Reconstruction, Union soldiers stationed here. And there are some accounts that he liked to harass people who had fought for the Confederacy. And so, whether it was, there's some stories from the law side of things that, that the Grimes boys fought the marshal and the soldiers. And then of course there's a written account from the Grimes family. And so as you can imagine, it was a different viewpoint. So there's the Grimes boys get killed, and a mob forms. And if not for the Union soldiers that were stationed here, and one of the Grimes's fathers intervenes and says, "No, we've had enough bloodshed in the Civil War. we're not gonna shed more blood. But Lovejoy lasts a couple of years, and then there's a shift there's starting to be a shift in politics at the state level. And a guy named Laban John Hoffman comes around. Now, Hoffman had been in the state police, and for a period of time after the Civil War, Texas formed the state police. And there were actually as many as 40% of the state police officers were African American. It was very integrated. And at the time, the Texas Rangers, the Frontier Rangers, had been sort of disbanded at the time and were not really back to what we would consider as the Rangers. And there was a lot of violence, mob violence, and up in Hill County, just north of us, the governor ends up declaring martial law in and around Hillsboro, a small community outside of Hillsboro, and Laban John Hoffman was the state policeman that they sent to Hill County. And there was a couple of murders, and the mob tried to intervene with the state police. And there's letters. I've got letters that Hoffman wrote back to the governor's office saying, we need help. Our posse's not enough. And so ultimately, the governor declares martial law in Hill County. It's a very interesting story. You can go way down rabbit holes with all the stories and all the sides of the stories about whether it was lawful or not. Ultimately, a local judge ends up putting a warrant out for the lawmen. And so sort of a counter posse from the locals up there had chased down the lawmen, and it took the governor providing pardons, and because this local judge had issued warrants for their arrest. So Hoffman comes to Waco. He's stationed in Waco, in and around Waco anyway. And on September 5th of 1870, he takes the oath of office to be the marshal in Waco after Thatcher had left a few months before. And so Hoffman, he's doing his thing. Clearly, he's got a history. And early in the morning of January 5th, 1870, now he was, I'm sorry, that was the wrong one. He was killed.
When it's 71, you said he was appointed in 70, right?
Yeah, so he was appointed in September 5th, 1870, and he's murdered by the end of the year. And he's sitting in he's getting a shave down at the corner of what would now be 2nd and Franklin. And it says around noon, City Marshal Hoffman was in a barbershop. They called it the southwest corner of the Square and 2nd, which would now be around 2nd and Franklin, and getting a shave.
Yeah.
An unidentified man rode up on horseback, dismounted, entered the barbershop from the rear. He examined the leathered face of the marshal to make sure it was Hoffman. He walked behind the barber's chair and shot the marshal in the back of the head, killing him instantly. The man remounted and fired 2 shots at approaching policemen. As the man galloped to the bridge, he tossed the toll collector $1 and said, "Haven't time to wait for the change," and sped away.
Wow. Classic movie scene there too, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's also reflective of journalism of the period, how flowery.
No doubt.
Yeah.
So at the time, there was a guy that some of y'all may have heard of named John Wesley Hardin.
Yeah.
Who is purported to be one of the most violent outlaws in Texas history.
Yeah.
And I had never really known, but he had been in the area about that time up in Hill County, as a matter of fact.
Gotcha.
And so we don't know if he crossed paths with Hoffman when he was up there serving as a state policeman. Ultimately, they charged 2 people with Hoffman's death. One is a guy named George Thomason, alias Wild George. I think he was the trigger man, so to speak.
Of course.
You don't get that moniker for,
you got to earn it.
You gotta,
Wild George.
You're a long way from Wild Rick.
And they Texas Governor Edmund Davis, posted a $1,000 reward for the delivery of Wild George, dead or alive. And so George Thomason gets mortally wounded during that chase related to that murder of Laban Jane Hoffman, who was the first police officer in Waco to be killed in the line of duty. Well, John Wesley Hardin gets some of the blame. There's not a clear connection there,
Right.
But a warrant is put out for his arrest as well. And he gets arrested and ends up breaking out of the away from the police officers who had him over in East Texas, and goes on the run. Later on,
Which we talked a little bit about some of that story earlier. So he had 2 state police officers. Yep. They were escorting him back.
Yep.
And I mean, he was like 17 or 18 at the time.
Yep.
He was,
Edward Stakes and Jim Smalley were the police officers.
Right. And I guess they were going to camp for the night or something. And one of the officers went off to get firewood or something. And Hardin had a gun secreted somewhere on his body and pulls it out, shoots the guy who was still guarding him, and rides off.
So Hardin, he goes on to actually a long career in as an outlaw. Ends up writing a biography later in years, and historians disagree about what is true or not true in his biography, and what is just pontification and grandiose stories. But he swears he didn't kill Laban Jane Hoffman and didn't have anything to do with it later on. But it is a connection, and while George probably had some connection to him at the time, but for a long time there was documentation that John Wesley Hardin was the shooter. But we know pretty accurately that it was Wild George. I was able to find Hoffman's payroll stubs from the state of Texas for being in the state police. And then, interesting to sort of muddy the story a little bit, it turns out that Laban John Hoffman might not have been as squeaky clean as some people might imagine. So there was a law firm named Flint, Chamberlain, and Graham, attorneys at law and real estate agents in Waco, Texas. And on December 23rd, before the marshals murdered, they write a letter, a handwritten letter to the governor, Davis, in Austin. And clearly they've written him before. They say, I wrote you sometime in the past about Laban James Hoffman, city marshal, and stated that there were indictments against him and he could not reflect credit on your administration. I now include a copy of an indictment from the district clerk of Ellis County. There are 2 also pending in Neal County on which a no prosecution was entered at the court term of the clerk because there had been a charge of district attorney and no prosecution had been made for the trial. I have no feeling in this matter, but I do know that Hoffman can reflect no credit on the appointing power. All the city of Waco wants is good and efficient and honest law enforcement. Your humble servant, Mr. J. Flint. And so, sure enough, I was able to get in the archives, the state archives, and I found where he had been indicted, where Hoffman had been indicted in Ellis County in the district court. Now, he had been indicted for activity a couple of years before in 1867. So that would have been right in the middle of Reconstruction. And so some would argue, well, maybe yes, maybe not, but regardless, and don't forget they had put a warrant out for these lawmen up in Hill County because they were discharging their lawful duties. So, he had been indicted. It says the grand jurors within the county of Ellis, duly elected, tried, impaneled, sworn, and charged to the inquiries in and for the body of the county, do indict Laban James Hoffman, late of said county, with force and arms in the county and state aforesaid on the 7th day of October, this year of our Lord, 1867, without consent of Virginia Rawson, the owner thereof, with intent to defraud, he did deface the brand of our mayor, M-A-R-E, the horse, the same not being then in their property of said Laban James Hoffman. So back then, changing the brand on a horse was a felony offense.
I mean, that's high crime right there.
And so it's hard to argue, that.
Well, and historically, like you're discussing, there was a fine line between criminal and law enforcement elements. And I mean, I'm not saying that's that way today, but there's probably personality-wise, there's probably some not a big difference between crossing that line.
Ryan, you can refute that.
Well, I mean,
he just made a dramatic connection to now.
I'm saying historically. Yes.
it can be a fine line for sure. Certainly back then, like we were talking about earlier, this was the Old West.
Yeah.
And it took a certain type of person to stand up for some of these things.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they weren't genteel about it. They didn't go to finishing school before they were selected as the marshal in the Old West, because they would not have necessarily been very effective during that time, had they been those kinds of folks.
Well, and they didn't have a system standing behind them. I mean,
Right.
Civil rights probably wasn't much of a thing then.
Yeah.
I would think.
For sure. Well, no, we see that. Waco's got a long history of that. And I've always argued that the police force, both now and then, is merely the public-facing arm of the local government.
Yeah.
And so whatever's going on in the local government at the time is generally what you see from the police forces.
Mm-hmm.
And that was certainly true back then. And you kind of see it now, even post civil service, because the police officers like to say, well, we're not impacted by politics. But the reality is that most chiefs of police, certainly in the state of Texas, are appointed by city managers or whoever the executive is of the city or town, and that city manager is usually works at the behest of the city council, who are elected officials. And so when people say police aren't affected by politics, we like to think that, and the reality is that the individual officers are not necessarily, because they have civil service protection, but the chiefs are absolutely touched by politics in some ways.
Well, and even thinks back then there probably wasn't a uniform code of law from the state, and so every community was writing their own laws.
Yeah. Well, and they would say, and you see it later in the next gentleman we're going to talk about, the city says, go enforce this. And it's up to the marshal to figure out how to enforce that.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes violence met violence. There was I ran across one of the handwritten council notes back in the 1850s that talked about building the first jail, and they called it a hoosegow or a calaboose. They called it a calaboose, and they described it as
how do you spell that? Calaboose.
Yes, that's how you spell it.
Okay.
And
Calaboose.
That's how they spelled it in the
Yeah.
document.
Yeah.
Calaboose.
There you go.
And that comes from the Hispanic word for prison or dungeon. And they described it as a 2-story log building, and you entered on the second floor, and there was a square hatch in the middle of the second floor that you lowered the prisoners down into, so that there was no way out of that first floor. There were no windows or doors on that first floor. And the city, there's a council notes talking about them deciding to they formed a committee, as we always do, and they recommended back.
Did
to
they
the
hire an
city
outside
council.
consultant? Because that's what you always do
I think
too.
Capstone built that originally. So they built a calaboose, and there was, I think, I'm trying to remember, it was $2,500 or something. It was a significant amount of money. But that was their first city jail. Now, there had been a county jail for a long time, but that was their first city jail. And so that tells you that they're starting to have that need.
So I just want to reiterate that design, because it's a little bit out of a horror movie.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's a first floor with the only access or any opening in the first floor is in the ceiling.
Yes.
Where they would raise and lower prisoners down into the first floor.
Yep.
So, but not impervious, right? It's not a.
As it turns out, there was actually a breakout early on. The daughter of one of the prisoners secreted a gun in and pulled it on the policeman who was serving as the jailer at the time, and broke her daddy out. And so there was actually a jailbreak from there. So once again, the gun ruled the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
For sure.
Now, I don't know if this is the place to talk about your research that discovered when the force integrated, which I thought that was really interesting.
Originally the all of the research showed that C.F. Franklin was the first African-American officer in, I believe, 1945. But I've been able to find a written document from, and I'm just looking for it here real quick. I know it was 1871. Here it is. And on June 12th, 1871, B.F. Harris, the mayor, called a meeting of the city council. The object of the meeting was explained by the chair to be for the appointment and secretary of one colored policeman. William Prince was nominated and unanimously confirmed. The council had adjourned at 5:00 p.m.
Okay.
So the first documented African-American police officer on June 12th, 1871.
It was William Prince is the name.
William Prince.
Okay.
And before now, we didn't know that. And so that's important history. And of course, it goes back to people were used to at the time with the state police, as much as 40% of that force was African-American.
Right.
And so, it turns out that it was integrated and it ebbed and flowed through time,
Yeah, sure.
as long as politics came and went.
Sure.
But there was one of the things that I've discovered in my research is that it turns out that some of these folks were doing it for the right reason, and they were fighting for the right things, and they stood up to mob violence. And that Waco has this long history of people not standing up to mob violence, but I've got more than a couple of researched situations where there were individuals who stood up and did the right thing. And in the case of a guy who would become a Texas Ranger, he started out as a Waco policeman and then went to be a sheriff's deputy and then went to and saved the sheriff's life during a riot with the KKK down in Lorena. He goes on to be a Texas Ranger appointed by Pat Neff, and then comes back to Waco and ends up being the police chief in the late 1940s up to 1950. A guy named Marvin Red Burton, which a lot of people have heard about, and there's a chapter in the book, Just One Riot, about that one of the authors did about the Texas Rangers. But he and the sheriff stood up to a crowd of between 3,000 and 10,000 people, depending on which story you read. And it wasn't just standing up, because they were shot and stabbed. And then the story goes that he was able to bring this Sheriff Buchanan back to Waco with the help of some Waco policemen. One of the Waco policemen that assisted them was a guy named Wiley Stem Sr., whose grandson, a lot of his family ended up working for the city of Waco through the years. I've had the pleasure of working for Wiley Stem III. Wiley Stem Sr. Gives Red Burton his .45 as they're huddled in a store down in Lorena, and we have that .45 in the police museum. And Burton uses that .45 to hold off the crowd, gets Buchanan back to Waco. The next morning, the mob has decided they're going to kill Red Burton, and he walks out into the crowd, and there's several documented stories about it, that he puts a 12 gauge under his coat, walks out and faces all of the citizens eye to eye, knowing that he probably was not going to make it back to there, and makes a big circuit, throughout downtown, and goes back, and he faced down the crowd, and they left him alone from there. And he goes on to be a really sought after special ranger, fought gambling, and during Prohibition fought the liquor, that sort of thing as a special ranger. Comes back to Waco, runs for sheriff a couple of times and doesn't become sheriff, but ends up going back into law enforcement and becomes the police chief. Now at the end of his career, there's some issue that somebody said that he had used prison labor illegally, and so he leaves office in 1950. But as far as colorful individuals and somebody who shows no fear and was standing up for the right things throughout his career, that's the kind of thing movies are made of, and that happened right here in Waco, Texas. Connections to Pat Neff. And these folks, were around Lawrence Sullivan Ross, who was here, good and bad. That it turns out these were human beings, and they were flawed, and they were gifted, but they stood in the arena to stand for the law at the time. It was not always nice, and it wasn't always pleasant, and there's clear oppression of different populations, but you have to put it in the context of what was going on at the time and what they were capable of doing and standing up, and there are a number of people who did stand up for the right things.
Yeah, you see that in the record, right? In the 20s, I mean, Waco had such a horrible history of uncontrolled mob violence, but you do see that in the 20s, where particularly after Jesse Thomas, there's a big effort on the part of Waco police to suppress that sort of justice.
Yeah, and just the case y'all are talking about on some of your other podcasts, Roy Mitchell. I've got the paper where the chief of police, V.F. McCall, calls for 22 Waco police officers notified for duty in the Mitchell case. Well, 22 officers was the department.
That's everybody.
So they put the department on, to resist mob violence because of that horrible history through the teens up to this point in time.
Similar, a guy that would have been known to Burton at the time. I watched the Costner movie the other night about Bonnie and Clyde, where he played Frank Hammer.
Yep.
And I found in the record where Hammer was sent here a couple times to quell mob violence because of some court case going on. But just looking into Hammer a little bit more after watching the movie, probably like Burton and a lot of these other guys, I mean, they didn't do what you did. They didn't go to get a professional degree in law enforcement. Usually they were a tough kid growing up and kind of may have been on one side or other of the law, but then get a break.
Yeah.
And, get deputized by some little law enforcement agency. And then that starts a career that leads to opportunities.
Well, and Hamer is represented in that movie as having a bright line in the sand of where his ethics were, and that in a number of stories we get that for Red Burton, because he starts out as a Waco policeman, and the story is that when Prohibition was put into place, that some of the policemen would turn a blind eye to liquor shipments, and he wouldn't do it. And so the then chief said, "Hey, if you can't play along, then you're making it hard for me, and I got to put you on a different shift." And he said, "Well, I'm not turning a blind eye." And so the chief then puts him on a different shift. So then that's when he leaves and goes to work for McLennan County Sheriff's Office, Buchanan at the time, the sheriff.
Gotcha.
And a couple of years later was the Lorena riot.
Right.
And so he had that reputation as and those folks can be hard to manage, if you're the person.
This is a chief.
Hold on. Is this a personal experience that we're talking about now?
Well, I'm just saying, if you can imagine somebody who wears that on their shoulder, and, because there's a spectrum for a lot of people, but his was a bright line in the sand. And by all accounts, that's why the charges at the end of his career that he was somehow breaking the law don't fit with the rest of his career, and you wonder how much politics played into it. Not that politics would ever get involved in city government.
Never.
But you just wonder, because it didn't match any of the other concrete examples when his ethics shone bright, and he stood up to both mob violence and follow the law and all those things. And so it doesn't fit, but it's a rabbit hole I'm going to go down and do more research on and see what we can find out. So,
Yeah.
So another guy that comes along in February of 1870 after Hoffman is killed, a guy named R.D. Compton. And Compton is the marshal for a long time. He takes his oath on February the 10th, got his copy of his oath. He's not originally from Waco, and that's something that, you sort of get as you're doing this is nobody was from Waco
Mm-hmm.
at
Sure.
the time.
Yeah, Waco was so
everybody
new.
was
Yeah.
from somewhere else. You
Yeah.
know, certainly Anglos were not from Waco, and so Compton becomes the marshal. And one of the things that preceded that, you know, this is right after the Civil War, and there are two different stories about how General McPherson of the Union Army was killed at the Battle of Atlanta. And one of the stories is that Compton, and both of these guys were at the Battle of Atlanta. The brigade that Compton was with was a local brigade. They were there at the Battle of Atlanta. There are a number of eyewitness accounts. It says Compton was the one that killed McPherson. McPherson was the second highest ranking Union officer killed in battle, and that Compton was the one that fired the fatal shot.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's another eyewitness account from there that says a guy named Robert Coleman from a different brigade was the one that fired the final shot. But whether he fired the final shot or not, he was there. He had fought in the Battle of Atlanta, and so he comes back to Waco. Some revered in the Confederate Army,
Right. Loathed.
loathed
By the Union.
He had turned down any kind of. They tried to promote him a number of times based on that interaction where he allegedly killed McPherson. He kept turning that down. They said he was a man of, he was humble about just everything. He didn't want to be there doing those things, but it was the context of life at the time.
Right.
And so he comes back to Waco and is pretty quiet as a marshal, except that there was this thing called the Waco Bridge Company. And so their charter said that you couldn't have another bridge or ferry or crossing within 5 miles of their
Right.
crossing. And it says they can run the ferry there at the low water point until they get their bridge built, and then they can charge a toll for the bridge. Well, apparently the bridge company took that to mean that they could keep people from traversing lengthwise up and down the river for that same distance. And in Waco, that portion of land on the west side of the river was set aside as a reserve for city use. And so the city council told Compton, you've got to go and enforce we want people to have free access up and down the river. We're not infringing on the rights of the bridge company to have access across the river, but
because often the river was low enough to walk across.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Or to run cattle across or whatever else. So Compton went out and enforced the ordinance. And so the Waco Bridge Company sued Compton and the city of Waco to have an injunction placed. Well, the lower court put the injunction in place, but ultimately Compton et al. Versus the Waco Bridge Company went to the Texas Supreme Court, and the Texas Supreme Court overturned it. Years after Compton was out of office, by the way, overturned it and said that the city could have, they could control the reserve area that goes on to be the reservation, that they could control that area, and that the bridge company couldn't stop them from doing that. Mm-hmm. So Compton's name appears, when I got into law enforcement, I was always told you never want your name on a Supreme Court case because there's no good way to get there. But we found that while we were looking at Compton's records, and he had represented the city, and that was part of the gig. Still is today, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, you can be sued personally.
Yeah.
If you see old pictures of the bridge, you can see the fences that they put up on either side of the bridge to try to control any sort of access to that hard rock crossing underneath the bridge. I mean, they were very aggressive at trying to protect their franchise there.
Trying to run a business,
Through time, so Compton is the marshal from 1871 through 1880-ish. There's some records of some folks. I guess they were maybe brothers, John Moore and Luke Moore. They were policemen, and occasionally they'd step in as the marshal. I'm assuming, if you were off, on vacation or got sick.
Right,
They had to have
right.
somebody function as the marshal, because at that day and time, the mayor was a magistrate. The mayor was a judge. And so we have a book of special mayor's hearings. And it was, a lot of times it was simple stuff of, somebody shooting a gun inside the city limits, or assaulting somebody, a simple assault or a simple theft or something. And the mayor was the judge. And so the marshal was the person on all those documents who had to either receive the fine or ensure the person was in jail or carry out whatever the sentence was. And most of the time, those were sort of, petty crimes that the mayor saw. We have to assume that the significant crimes went to the county court and the district courts. So you had to have a marshal to support the mayor's court, so to speak. And it wasn't until the later version of the charter that you see the mayor stop doing those court cases. So
Interesting. Yeah, really interesting.
and you see that in all of those handwritten documents, that it clearly, certainly in the 1850s, these were just people who happened to live in the same place, and they were just trying to cobble together
They were making it up as they went along.
Literally
Yeah.
making it up. They're trying to cobble together government based
Right.
on what they've heard about in the East. And you kind of get that sense as you're reading those handwritten notes that they're just doing the best they can. And there were a number of them where they were like, we're here to install a new alderman because the last guy lasted 2 meetings.
Right.
And there are some significant names. There's a lot of streets named after those original folks around. And some fought in the Confederacy and some fought in the Union ultimately.
Yeah.
But that was the context at the time. These were human beings trying to put together a government as best they could. And it really shines through those handwritten documents.
So you mentioned he has a long tenure.
Yep.
And then who follows them?
So Alfred Neal follows him, and that's who we thought originally was the first chief of police. And we actually have photos of Alfred Neal. We have photos of all the chiefs after Alfred Neal.
Okay.
Alfred Neal, best I can find, he comes in about 1888.
Okay.
And he was in 1886 he was listed as the street commissioner. So he had already been in city service, makes the transition somewhere between 1886 and 1888 to be the marshal. And Alfred C. Neal stays as the marshal through 1894. A guy named Sam Hall becomes marshal in 1895, and he stays through 1897. A guy named M.P. Waddell, 1897 to 1899. So these are, 2, 3, 5 year sort of tenures. And then John Dollins and he was kind of a local name, 1899 to 1907. So he's turn of the century.
Yeah.
A lot of really interesting things happening in Waco at the turn of the century, like the Suspension Bridge and the Washington Street Bridge a couple of years later after the turn of the century.
Really, as we've talked about, a lot of the buildings, the classic buildings in downtown.
Yes.
I mean, now we're starting to hit those golden years of the city growing, and
I bet we get motorized under his tenure as well.
Yeah, you do start seeing. I've seen photos, certainly in the early 1900s, of motorization of both police and fire. We start seeing some of the fire apparatus being driven by steam instead of horses for a long time there. Up through the 1920s, Waco PD was one of the first agencies in the South to have motorcycles. And we've got some really interesting pictures of some very early motorcycles that you kind of see in the old Harley Davidson kind of thing, but real sparse build, real early motors in the early 1900s. And some of these folks, you're talking about a time period when, so Lawrence Sullivan Ross had become the governor at the turn of the century. And so you're still talking about, it's still kind of the Old West, even though you're starting to see motorization of things. And Camp MacArthur comes in 1917 or 1918 for the First World War. And so that's when you really start seeing changes in things. And that's a burden on the police department too. So when you get those flying machines in Waco, they've got to manage that and the cars and boats. And y'all have had a number of podcasts talking about the river and what was going on the river. And so that was all the purview of the local police department. And occasionally some of these folks would go on to be mayor. They'd stay in public service, but a lot of them just go back to their lives. R.D. Compton, who we were talking about, he ends up moving away and gets killed in a train crash in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a number of years later in his retirement. And so they just, they had a job, then they became marshal, and then they quit being marshal and went back to their lives, returned to the regular citizenry, and rode off into the sunset.
Yeah, I think Dollins, who you mentioned a minute ago, later became mayor, if I remember.
I believe that's right. Yeah, mayor. He became mayor in 1916.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and some other folks you recognize, Hollis Barron, Guy McNamara, which I believe is Parnell's grandfather or great-grandfather. Lee Jenkins, F.V. McCall, Hollis Barron. You really start getting into that time period when civil service came in the 40s. With Red Burton was the who had been the ranger, and he comes back to Waco and he becomes the police chief. They said he became the chief of detectives and then chief of police. Ironically, with Wiley Stem Sr. Wiley Stem Sr. was chief of detectives and about that time too. So they crossed paths a number of times during their career. J.V. Gunterman and Calvert, and then a guy named A.J. Rosnovsky, Al Rosnovsky. He became the chief in 1975. And when I took the oath of office for chief of police, Al sent me a card, one of the first people to send me a card and sort of wish me the best and, tell me heavy is the head, it carries the mantle, so to speak. But just, and I still have that card. I cherish it. And a series of chiefs since then, since Al, you had Larry Scott and Gilbert Miller. Gilbert Miller came from Austin. He was really the first chief to bring neighborhood policing into effect in the early 90s. In Waco, crack cocaine hit in the mid 90s. And so you had some years where we had 32 murders a year, and it was really a lot of violence on the street. But under Gil's leadership, we instituted sort of that old school neighborhood policing. Al Mellis, who had came from Florida, carried that on. And then, of course, Brent Stroman was the chief for several years, a little over a decade, I believe. And then I had the pleasure of serving after Brent, and then now Chief Victorian, who is just, carries charisma around in buckets and is just fantastic. She's brilliant. I couldn't be more pleased that she's our chief, and she carries on a legacy of a lot of folks before her, and a lot of really good men and women serve in the Waco Police Department. They go on more than 100,000 calls for service a year. And so they really do the things, and a lot of times they do it quietly. And they interface more than ever. They're interfacing with our community, and making sure that those interactions are positive interactions. It hasn't always been that way. We learned early on that when you put on the uniform, you take on the sins of the forefathers, because when people come here from other countries, they only know police the way they knew them in their country. Yeah. And a lot of times those are federalized law enforcement. And so a whole different way of doing things, and really fear and intimidation. And so it's easy to understand why I was often asked, about serving the community. And I always say, well, which community? Yeah. Because it turns out Waco is a lot of communities that happen to all live in the same place. And so you have to interface with those communities a little bit differently. How, the old saying, meet people where they are. And so that's what it takes today, is to meet people where they are, how they need law enforcement, how they need peace officers, and be there to protect them and hold people accountable, hold ourselves accountable. It's, it really has changed since the early days, but there's still that connection. There's that thread that goes back to the Old West.
Okay, so today the police is headquartered. You got the tower over by where the old Hillcrest Hospital used to be.
3115 Pine.
How many stories is that tower?
It's 11 stories. My understanding is that the first 4 floors were built in 1971-ish.
Okay.
And then they came back and added the top 6 stories. First 4 floors are poured in place concrete. The top 6 stories are pure tension or post tension concrete. And so when we bought it as part of a bond package, it was the 07 bond package. We ended up moving in 2013, and we were able to consolidate all but 1 unit of the police department in the tower. We had been spread out at a number. The former headquarters was at 721 North 4th. Now is the IT department and the emergency operations center. So that building is still serving. And before that, the police department was on the top floor of City Hall. And so the current City Hall that is there now, built in the 20s, used to be the jail on the top floor. The Sally Port was on the Washington Street side. They would drive the car down. The ramp is still there, but you can't get a car in there anymore. And then they had a special elevator that only went to the 4th floor. And so you would take your prisoner in there and go straight up to the 4th floor. And I have heard stories of people who are still around today who can remember prisoners hanging out of the windows at City Hall and hollering at people around the square. One of the commanders who was there when I started would tell me stories when he was a rookie 40 years before that, that they would pour their own bullets using lead and the molds in the basement of then City Hall. So you can imagine the lead they were exposed to. And then before that, the same thing was in the previous City Hall before that. They had a jail there, the City Hall that burned at the same location, sort of at the same location. So, the police department hadn't been many places, but that's the history.
So with the tower that's there now, I mean, tell us how many officers you have, but then the support staff it takes as well, because that's.
Yeah, so they're right at 290 sworn positions now, and in the past couple of decades, we've had about 100 civilians in the building too. So you have around 400 employees in the building that it takes to make it run. You have, on the civilian side, all of the dispatch center is civilian. So when you dial 911 from anywhere except other cities in McLennan County, the call goes to the tower. The main public safety answering point for 911 is in that tower, and Waco dispatches for both Waco PD and McLennan County Sheriff's Office out of the same spot. So they talk to each other while they're, because we overlap. And so you have the dispatch center. Your other civilians there are a lot of civilians in the records section, property room, impound lot. We civilianized under Gil Miller, I believe. We civilianized crime scene investigation. So, people used to watch CSI Las Vegas, kind of the same thing. We have some really great civilians that go get forensic degrees and come to work in crime scene. When I first started, they were making that transition, and they still had what they called special investigators, who were sworn officers, and they would go to the scene and lift fingerprints and work the hard, the murder scenes and those, sexual assaults and those sorts of things. But we were early adopters, thanks to the leaders we had at the time, of putting those officers back on the street and putting civilians in those roles. So Waco's kind of been ahead of the curve in that way, of civilianizing those positions. And because they can go get, very specific degrees and and whereas the police officers are generalists, have to do a little bit of everything. They got to be psychologists and social workers, and
most of them are going into the trade because they want the action that's associated with being a police officer. Not
the number one answer. And I sat in on a lot of interviews. I hired a lot of police officers, and the number one answer that we heard in every one of them was, "I want to help people." And so Now they don't always know what that means when they're getting into it, and
Right.
it can change when you get out and you see. I think we were having a conversation the other day about most people who commit crimes have just made a mistake of some sort. It's a very small percentage of people who are out to get other human beings. And so the good news is that most of the people police officers deal with are good folks. They've just made a mistake. But there are occasionally, and y'all have talked about them on this podcast and on the Crossroads podcast, the serial killers and those folks have come through Waco or been in Waco.
Yeah.
And so the department has to be prepared for that as well. So it's a spectrum they have to be prepared for. They've about 400 employees over there now, working around 100,000 calls for service. And once the call's over, that's not the end of it. Then you've got detective units that have got to do something with that case. And their whole job is to work on behalf of the victim and on behalf of the state, so to speak, and present a good case to the district attorney's office. And people underestimate that relationship that's needed with the district attorney's office, because ultimately they and the grand juries decide what cases will go forward or not. And it's always been that way. You can go back in historical documents, and the district attorney or the prosecutors really dictated to the police means and methods, and what's legal and not legal, and how to investigate crimes, and what the needs are to get convictions, because the need to get convictions today are a lot different than they were even 15 years ago.
Yeah. Early in your career.
Yeah. So police have to adapt to that, have always had to adapt to that.
So I'm going to give you both a little insight into the nature of podcasting. I've learned this in my few years podcasting. So some podcast episodes will get you like from here to Temple. Generally, the Waco History Podcast will get you from North Dallas to Waco as far as in length of a podcast episode. So I will say former Chief Holt, current Assistant City Manager Holt is too interesting for one podcast episode. And so I'm going to ask you here on the record if you'll come back, because I've got more questions.
On the record.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay. Well, I'd like to call this part one. Can we call this part one then?
Absolutely.
Rick, are you game for calling this part one? Because I have a lot of questions that
you can't call it part two, obviously, because it's the first one.
Yeah,
so, sure.
But I don't want to cut him off. I mean, do you want to cut him off?
No,
It's
I could do
too
this forever.
interesting. Yeah. So I think we'll call this part one. I want to thank you for, first off, all the research you've done. I mean, that is so beneficial to understand the history of this. Of this essential service to the city, and the way in which it's interwoven with the history of this place that we try to explore through the podcast. And so we'll call that the end of part one, and we'll pick up with part two. And you did a great job of getting us up to now, and you had to do a leap to do this. But we're going to start out part two by going back, because there's some things I really want to ask about, even the late 19th century and as it transitions to the 20th, and get into your career a little bit more and some of the changes that you've seen. So thanks for joining us again, as you've just on the record committed to do.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about what I think is a noble profession. Now hasn't necessarily always represented that way, but still, we need to look at the history sometimes so we don't repeat it.
Yeah.
But proud of where they are now.
That's been really enlightening.
Great, thank you.
Ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Reach San Antonio.
This has been a Rogue Media Network production.
Frozen, heroes, Gonna tell you about frozen, heroes. Gonna tell you about.
Hey, I'm Zach,
And I'm Mike.
and we have a fantastic new podcast to tell you about. Bros, Foes, and Heroes. It's the two of us looking into the world of comics, breaking down some characters that you may have never heard of, and some that are just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, so Zach comes up with a character each time, and I go into it just completely blind. I don't know who this person is or what their abilities are or anything, and basically I guess we kind of go over their origin story and just some of the ridiculous stuff that maybe, especially Golden Age stuff.
Oh, Golden Age stuff is always the best, and we will make sure to highlight all of the shenanigans and just absolute weirdness of everything.
Yeah, that's right. So subscribe today and follow us on Instagram at Bros, Foes, Heroes.
And if you don't, I know where you live. Not really, but please subscribe.
Frozen, heroes. Gonna tell you about frozen, heroes. Gonna tell you about.
Hi, I'm Hank. You might remember me from a show called King of the Hill. Check out a King of the Hill rewatch podcast. These boys ain't right, but they are funny. Find the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts or at roguemedianetwork.com. I tell you what.